Okay, so this is going to be our last little segment of our logic setup for the course. So this time around, we're going to look at some basic forms of argument using conditionals that we learned about last time. And within that, we're going to learn about some logical fallacies. We're also going to learn about some informal fallacies at the end. So here are two classic forms of argument. I'm just going to cover up that other one for a moment. So the first one is called modus ponens. This is just a fancy Latin name, but it'll be good for you to just have that memorized. So just try to keep using it and try to keep trying to identify arguments within this structure. But here's the idea. You'll remember that we learned about conditionals, where you take a smaller sentence like P and another sentence like Q, and then you can make a compound sentence, which is a conditional in this case, to say something like if P then Q, right? So your sentence might say something like if it's raining, then the ground is wet. Well, we can get an argument out of it by stating if P then Q, then we say P, right? So we state the conditional, and then we simply state the antecedent. Well, that's enough to get us a conclusion of the consequent. So we say if it's raining, then the ground is wet. It is, in fact, raining. Therefore, the ground is wet. Right? So this is a valid argument. Remember when we said arguments are valid, we said if you grant the truth of 1 and 2, then 3 has to be true. Right? So we're saying that any argument where you have a conditional and you have a conditional and then you state the antecedent, you can validly conclude the truth of the consequent. Right? So you just need to make sure that you have your P's in the right place. So you have if it's raining right here at the start of your conditional, your it's raining right here as your second premise, and then you're having the consequent, the Q from your conditional, in the same place, in the right places, right? So as the consequent of the conditional and as the conclusion of the argument, right? So that's sort of a straightforward and classic example of a valid argument. Now let's look at another one. So this argument is called modus tollens. Again, another fancy Latin name, but it's good to just have these concepts available when you start thinking about philosophical arguments. So here's how modus tollens goes. It says, if it's raining, then the ground is wet. Right? But then somebody says, well, the ground isn't wet, therefore it's not raining. So this argument goes like this. If P then Q, not Q, therefore not P, right? So we're saying like, in the outdoors where there's no shelter, we can say like, if it's raining, then the ground is wet. But if we then notice that the ground isn't wet, we can validly conclude from that it's not raining, right? Because what's going on here? It says that if it's raining, we have a guarantee that the ground is wet. Well, the ground ain't wet, so it must not be raining, right? And again, we're just making sure to be really careful with how our conditional is built. And then here we have a denial of the consequent, which allows us to make the next logical step, which is to deny the truth of the antecedent. So these are two classic valid argument forms. Now again, not all valid arguments have true premises. Remember, for an argument to be valid, we just have to say, let's assume that the premise is true, and then see what follows from it. And validity is all about whether a certain conclusion follows, right? Because, like, we could, put in any two random sentences here. If the sun is shining, then ducks are made of chocolate, right? Ducks are not made of chocolate, therefore the sun is not shining. But that's absurd and ridiculous. But in that case, what's wrong with it isn't the logical structure of that argument. It's just this absurd statement that somehow sunshine and the composition of ducks in the form of chocolate is, a false statement. So that's an instance when we put absurd sentences into conditionals and then run a modus tollens argument. That's one of those cases where the argument has good structure, it just doesn't have true premises. Okay, but we also need to be really careful when we argue using conditionals, because there are arguments which look a lot like modus ponens and modus tollens, but which are actually bad arguments. So you might see somebody make an argument that says, like, if P then Q, not P, therefore not Q. And you might think to yourself, oh yeah, well, P guarantees Q, P is not the case, so Q is not the case. That's a very tempting line of thought, but it's mistaken, right? Here's why. It's because just because P guarantees Q, you can't conclude not Q from not P, because in many cases, something can be guaranteed as a consequence of another condition, but it might be that there are many ways of bringing about that condition that don't appeal to the antecedent. So let's look at this one. If I'm riding a bicycle, then I must be alive. I'm not riding a bicycle, therefore I'm not alive. Now, here's the thought. If you're riding a bike, you're not dead. The dead do not ride bikes. But just because I'm not riding a bike, that's not a good reason to think that I'm dead, right? Because, in this case, there are a lot of different ways of being alive, right? Like another one is sitting at a computer recording a video about logic, right? That's another way of being alive. So this argument, which we call denying the antecedent, right? Because the conclusion is a denial, the second premise is a denial of the antecedent of the conditional. So they call it denying the antecedent because you're denying the antecedent in your second premise and making a fallacious argument on its basis. So that one, again, says if P then Q, not P, therefore not Q. And we say, like, look, just because P guarantees Q, the absence of P isn't a guarantee of the absence of Q, because there can be a lot of different ways that Q might be brought about, is the thought. Now let's look at this other kind of argument. This one is called affirming the consequent, right? So again, it gets its name because it involves affirming the consequent of an argument, or of a conditional, in your second premise. So here's how this one goes. We say, if I'm riding a bicycle, then I must be alive, right? If I'm riding a bike, then I'm alive. I'm alive, therefore I must be riding a bike. So this one says, if P then Q, Q, therefore P, right? But we can see what's wrong with that in this example, right? Yeah, riding a bike guarantees that you are alive. In fact, the dead don't ride bikes. But just because you're alive doesn't mean that you're riding a bike. Because again, there are a lot of things that you might be doing which would be a good guarantee that you're alive. Doesn't necessarily mean that you're doing all of them, right? So you've got to be careful when you argue using conditionals, because even though modus ponens and modus tollens are valid argument forms, denying the antecedent and affirming the consequent are invalid forms. So just to put this on a chart, just so you can see the difference between all the kinds, right? Here's how modus ponens goes. If P then Q, P therefore Q. You see that's different from affirming the consequent, which says if P then Q, Q therefore P. So the arguments in green are good forms of argument, valid forms of argument. The forms of argument in pink over here are fallacious, right? Fallacious just means attempting but mistaken form of argumentation. So just remember that every argument that takes the form of modus ponens or modus tollens will be valid, right? And every argument that takes the form of affirming the consequent or denying the antecedent will be invalid, right? Now again, we can use our skill of developing counterexamples when we identify an invalid form of argument. So in the conditionals video, I showed you that you can use a counterexample to show that a conditional is false, right? Because a conditional tells you that the antecedent guarantees the consequent. Well, you can also use a counterexample to show that the premises do not guarantee the truth of the conclusion, right? So we can say that like a counterexample can be used to show an argument is invalid, much in the way that we're using counterexamples to falsify a conditional. So you can imagine somebody making an argument like this. If a raccoon had gotten into my apartment, it would be a mess in here. It is a mess in here, so those raccoons must be added again. So if we actually take a look at this, we're saying like, look, if raccoons are in the apartment, it's a mess, therefore raccoons. So that argument actually takes the form of affirming the consequent, right? If raccoons had gotten in, it would be a mess. It is a mess, therefore it was raccoons. But, we all know that there's a lot of ways to make a mess in this life, right? And it might have been that your roommate messed things up. Or, a door got blown open and it was the wind that made a mess. Right? So the idea here is that we can use counterexamples to display the invalidity of an argument. Some of them, like these ones, right? That just because you're not riding a bicycle doesn't mean that you're dead, or just because you're alive doesn't mean that you're riding a bike. So you should copy these forms of argument down, right? You should know that modus ponens and modus tollens are argument forms that are always going to be valid, whereas they're pesky sort of mirror images, affirming the consequent and denying the antecedent, are always invalid forms of argument. So you've got to watch out and make sure that the arguments that you make take the good form and not the bad form. So let's run through a few different examples of arguments. I think I've got 5 of them here. And then we'll get on to informal fallacies. So what you can do here is you can try to think about these in forms of like those if P then Q kind of sentences and figure out from that what form these are taking. So here's the first one. If I am a millionaire, I can afford to buy a new TV. I can afford to buy a new TV, therefore I'm a millionaire. So what do you think of that argument? Well, one thing that we can do is say, if P, then Q, that's our first statement. And then we have Q, therefore P. But that means that this is an instance of affirming the consequent, right? If P, then Q, Q, right? And we notice that we can also give a counterexample to this. So I will let you know that I am not a millionaire, and I could afford to buy a new TV, if I really needed one. The one I have right now is fine, so I'm not going to. But if that TV broke suddenly, I could scrape up, the $200 or $400 or whatever it costs to buy a new TV. So that shows that it's true that millionaires can afford to buy new TVs, but that just because you can afford to buy a new TV doesn't necessarily mean that you're a millionaire. It just means that you're a person with at least $200 or $400 that they can spend at the moment. Okay, here's one. If animals have rights, it's wrong to eat them. It's not wrong to eat animals. Therefore, animals don't have rights. Okay, so let's plug in the logical form of this argument. If P, then Q, right? So P is animals have rights, and Q is it's wrong to eat them. But then our second premise says it's not wrong to eat animals. So we've got a denial of the consequent, right? So we've got if P, then Q, not Q, and then our conclusion says, therefore animals don't have rights. Well, that's not P, right? So this argument actually says, if P, then Q, not Q, therefore not P. Now, if we look back at our chart, if P, then Q, not Q, therefore not P. Now, you might have a different opinion about this argument, right? You might think that it actually is wrong to eat animals, right? And in that case, you might think that this argument is unsound, right? But in terms of its logic, it says, look, if animals have rights, we can be guaranteed that it would be wrong to eat them, but because it's okay to eat animals, then they must not have rights. So whatever you happen to think of this argument, we can tell here that it is a logically valid argument because it takes the form of modus tollens. If P, then Q, not Q, therefore not P. All right, if my dog weighs more than me, then Pluto is a planet. My dog weighs more than me, therefore Pluto is a planet. So we can let dog weighs more than me be P, Pluto is a planet be Q. Second premise says P, and the conclusion is Q. So this is a case of modus ponens, right? If P, then Q, P, therefore Q. Now, in this case, we're finding a valid argument, but which is not sound, right? Because soundness is validity plus all true premises. Well, for one thing, premise one is false. Even if my dog did somehow end up weighing more than me, if I started wasting away and my dog got really fat, that wouldn't all of a sudden make Pluto a planet, right? Premise two is false. My dog weighs about 18 pounds, and I think that I've gained about that much weight since the pandemic started. So, premise two is false, and the conclusion is false. But remember, valid arguments can have false premises and false conclusions. They can still have good structure, right? Because this still has the structure, if P then Q, P therefore Q. So it's still a well-structured argument. Here's an interesting one. It says, first premise, anti-drug laws are morally legitimate only if paternalistic laws are acceptable. Now here's just something to notice. The textbook discusses this a little bit. The phrase only if will function the same as a statement that says if then, right? So, we could think of, let's see. If Bo is a dog, Bo is a mammal, right? If Bo is a dog, only if Bo is a mammal. So these actually logically state the same thing. There's a little tricky thing. If we say, you can say, Bo is a mammal if Bo is a dog. So instead of saying if P then Q, you're saying P if Q. But actually, and this is a little tricky, you can come talk to me if you want to understand this better. But if P then Q and P only if Q actually mean the same thing as Q if P, right? Bo is a mammal if Bo is a dog means the same thing as if Bo is a dog, then Bo is a mammal. You see, it gets reversed if you take out the only or if you take out the then part of the if-then statement. It's a little tricky thing. I can show you this during office hours if you want further explanation of that interesting point. To get back to this argument, I just wanted to point out that blank only if blank means the same thing as if blank, then blank, right? P only if Q means the same thing, logically speaking, as if P then Q. So we say, anti-drug laws are morally legitimate only if paternalistic laws are acceptable. Paternalistic laws are morally unacceptable. Therefore, anti-drug laws are not morally legitimate. So this has the structure if P then Q. And then this is a denial of Q, right? You can regulate drugs only if paternalism is okay, but paternalism is not okay. Therefore, anti-drug laws are not morally legitimate. So if P then Q, not Q, therefore not P. So that is modus tollens. So because that's modus tollens, then this is a valid argument. Now again, we might have a spirited disagreement about whether the first premise is true and whether the second premise is true, right? You might think that actually paternalistic laws are fine, or you might think that you can justify anti-drug laws separately from paternalism. And that's great. Just notice that when you get into those arguments, at that point, we're having an argument about the truth of the premises, and therefore the soundness, rather than the validity, which is all about logical structure. All right, let's wrap up quickly talking about informal fallacies. I pointed out that affirming the consequent and denying the antecedent are fallacies, where the word fallacy just means a line of reasoning which is very tempting to take, but which is problematic in terms of getting us to the truth. Right. So there are cases where people want to argue, like in cases of affirming the consequent or denying the antecedent, but there's something mistaken about these lines of thought, right? Now, These are logical problems with arguments that we can identify just by seeing the logical structure. There are also fallacies in arguments that involve certain informal styles of arguing. So let's run through these informal fallacies quickly. So, some informal fallacies include things like the ad hominem fallacy. This is from Latin, and it basically just means against the man or against the person. And this happens when we argue against somebody, instead of attacking the points that they're making, we attack the character of a person. Another thing that happens sometimes is you hear a person say, well, look, this philosopher tells us that we have to do so-and-so with our lives, but they didn't actually live by those principles. So far as it goes, that's interesting maybe, but it might actually, say more about that philosopher's character and their, tendency for hypocrisy rather than a problem with the views that they're defending. So that's one example of something that happens with ad hominem fallacies. But other times with ad hominem fallacies, it's a matter of ignoring a person's argument and saying, well, this person is dumb, or this person is obviously biased, or unable to think about this kind of question objectively. Those are all cases of attacking the person rather than the arguments that they're making. And we want to focus primarily in a philosophy class on the arguments that a person is actually putting on the page rather than critiquing their character or motives or maybe their social station. Another fallacy is sometimes called the appeal to authority. And this is appealing to an authority figure to substantiate a position outside their area of expertise. So this one can be tricky because certain appeals to substantiate a position can be very relevant, right? So, I can appeal to Dr. Fauci's advice on whether we should wear a mask out in public because, disease transmission is his area of expertise, right? But when it comes to, say, like celebrities who endorse a certain brand of toothpaste, right, they are outside their area of expertise. So the fact that so-and-so endorses a certain brand of toothpaste may be pretty irrelevant. Here's another one that you'll see a lot. It's sometimes called the appeal to ignorance. And it says that because something cannot be proven, it must be false. Right? So in these cases, you find people saying, well, like, this person cannot prove that I'm wrong, so I must be right. Or that this person cannot prove what they're saying, so it must be false. Well, that seems to be an unfair way of arguing. If there are things that we don't know, we just don't know them. But we can't conclude that the people that we're arguing against are wrong. It seems like when we do that, we're just arguing from a double standard. We also sometimes find appeals to irrelevant emotions. So, we might think of people trying to tell us what the law should be, and not by looking at the effects of different laws. They might make us think about very specific cases where maybe something bad happened to a specific individual, even though that's completely distracting us from broader questions about whether a law is going to be effective. We also find things like hasty generalization. So a good example of a hasty generalization is, you might buy a particular brand of car, you might buy a Ford, and it might run great and treat you well for years. And from that, you might draw a general lesson which says, like, Fords are great cars, and they're always more reliable than cars made by GM. It might be true, but it might not be. And, you can't draw a general lesson from a small number of cases. Again, you might imagine, spending a day in another state, spending the weekend in Tennessee, and, finding somebody who, treats you not very nice while you're there. That would be a hasty generalization if you started saying, well, I know from my experience one day that, everybody from Tennessee, or even everybody from Knoxville, is kind of a mean jerk, right? We shouldn't draw general lessons from small amounts of evidence. Here's a last one, the straw man fallacy. So oftentimes when we're doing philosophy, we have to compare our view with somebody else's competing view. But what you've got to avoid doing is depicting your opponent's position in a way that's super easy to refute, and in a way that diverts attention from the real target of the argument. So in this case, we always just want to make sure that even when we're arguing against a view that we don't like, we should not, develop a straw person version of that argument, because that won't be very interesting. You should argue against the best possible version of your opponent's argument. And if you're really convinced of your view, you should be able to offer objections against, the best version of your competing view, rather than, a silly version of an argument that's easy to refute. So that's it for this little series of videos on the basics of logic. Thanks for listening in, and as always, if you have any questions or concerns, please don't hesitate to get in touch with me. All right, take care.